Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Bacaresa-Balance, and on behalf of Cornell's Asian American Studies program and the Critical Moves Performance in Theory and Movement series, I want to welcome you all to Season of Glass, Love and Loss in Japanese America with Professor Joshua Chambers-Letson. Tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the Departments of Performing and Media Arts, History and History of Art, and the Visual Studies program here at Cornell. And I actually want to also, I'm not sure if he's in the room right now, but give a shout out to Joe Miranda and the Queer of Color Reading Group, who last year had invited Josh to campus, a visit that was cut, of course, abruptly by lockdown of the pandemic. And so I just wanted to shout out to Joe for his, starting off this conversation and the invitation to Josh. So tonight's event is also part of what we hope to make an annual event here at Cornell, in step with the annual commemoration of the Day of Remembrance for Japanese Americans. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which gave the US Army the authority to remove civilians from the military zones established in Washington, Oregon, and California during World War II. This led, of course, to the forced removal and incarceration of some 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast, to be sent to one of 10 concentration camps scattered across this country. On this Day of Remembrance, we choose to not only remember this state of exception in Japanese American or Asian American history, we choose to recognize, as Professor Chambers-Letson's work helps us to do, Japanese American concentration camps as one link in a chain of similarly spectacular practices in US history that, taken as a whole, become all too banal in their unjustifiable regularity. We choose to recognize, as activist groups such as Densho and Churu for Solidarity remind us, that places of Japanese American incarceration, such as Fort Sill in Oklahoma, have also served as the sites of imprisonment for Native Americans and 1,400 detained immigrant and refugee children and families in the last 2 years. That discourses of the need to perform patriotism and allegiance have also impacted South Asian, Middle Eastern, and Muslim communities in the wake of September 11th. That a political activist campaign for Japanese American reparations can work in solidarity with African American calls for reparations as well. So tonight, through the historical archive of Japanese American incarceration photographs and stories, Professor Chambers-Letson will help us think through the affective dimensions of love and loss as experienced in the camps and beyond, in the generations that survive in the wake of US, Japanese, and global histories. That this thinking through love, loss, and grief takes place in the midst of a global pandemic that has taken the lives of 2.43 million people across the globe, some of them our own family, friends, neighbors, and loved ones, is something for us to meditate upon tonight. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Please make sure you're muted throughout Josh's talk, but do please feel free to type questions into the chat during the talk or after during the Q&A, which of course we'll open up. Tonight's talk will be recorded, so just for note. And for anyone who does require closed captioning, there should be a button at the bottom where you can access a live transcript of tonight's talk as it's going on. So Joshua Takano Chambers-Letson is a professor of performance studies at Northwestern University. He is a writer and performance theorist who researches and teaches courses in performance studies, critical race theory, and queer of color critique. He is the author of A Race So Different, Law and Performance in Asian America, and After the Party, a manifesto for queer of color life. With Tavia and Nyong'o, he is the co-editor of Jose Esteban Munoz's The Sense of Brown. He is a friend who actually I first met as his TA in an intro performance studies class at NYU. And he is my younger sibling in the constellation of queer kinship that Jose himself cultivated. Like a younger brother who I continue to care for and learn from every single day. So please help me in welcoming Joshua Takano Chambers-Letson.
Thank you, Christine. I can't even express like the depth of gratitude and pleasure that I take in having been invited to come to Cornell by you, my big sister. And it is true. Christine TA'd class in my first year in graduate school. And I think one of my favorite memories of Christine, and it taught me my first pedagogical lesson, is we were having a session and some of the students were being particularly difficult. And Professor Balance sort of let them say their things. And then she sort of looked around at everyone and said, well, it's been real, but I have a Mary J. Blige concert to get to, and walked out of the room. And I knew right then, I was like, that is how you handle a difficult scenario in the classroom, is you go to a Mary J. Blige concert. So thank you, Christine, for the invitation to be here with you today, and that generous introduction. Thank you also to Joe for the initial invitation, as well as to Alexis for the work in pulling this together, and also Karen, who I know was there in the side helping. The material I'm going to present to you today, I feel slightly embarrassed to say, is not necessarily an academic talk. I'm not quite sure what it is, actually. Maybe a meditation might be the word, maybe a prayer. And when Christine invited me to talk, she asked me to sort of go into some of the material that I wrote about in my first book. And at first I was anxious, because I was like, well, I can't just go back. I didn't know how to go back to that material. And while I was talking with Christine, she was like, well, go back and revisit and rethink about it. So in some ways I have the sort of pleasurable opportunity of going back into material that I wrote and rethinking what I might say now about some of it, and then putting it in the context of some recent events. So I will say, for those of you that have read that book, Erase So Different, you might recognize some sentences and passages here. We might consider it a little bit of a remix, but one that has been structured by circuits of loss in my own family of late. So with that, I'll begin. And let me share my screen very quickly, so you don't have to stare at my face the whole time. There is in my family a photograph of my grandparents that I call my winter garden photograph. I keep it above my desk always. In the photograph, they are young, just barely in their early 20s, I think. It's a portrait of Black and Asian love, amongst other things. She's dressed up, a kimono, a katsura. He's in formal military dress, a young Marine, and there's this little girl with them, but no one quite knows who the girl is. The not knowing who she is has been a game of unserious speculation with my mother and her sisters and I for years. My mom and her twin were told that it was a neighbor girl, but no one quite trusted that answer. It could be my mother's cousin Yuriko, but she'd be too old. I think my family likes not knowing who the girl was, because the mystery of her presence made palpable our sense that there were depths in my grandmother's life that we simply could not know. Some kind of subtle beyond to that which we could reduce her to. To be honest, I don't know that we could have borne hearing the truth of all of it. So we settled for musing about unknown details like the little girl. I think of this little girl as the photograph's punctum. In Roland Barthes' melancholic and queer meditation on photography, Camera Lucida, he describes a punctum as the detail in a photograph that reaches out and arrests a spectator. It is a sting, a speck, a cut, a little hole, and also a cast of the dice. A photograph's punctum is that accident which pricks me, but also bruises me and is poignant to me. Having been gripped by the punctum, Barthes' spectator develops a unique and indeterminate affective relationship with the image and its subjects. They, the spectator, animates the photo as much as they are animated by it, in a kind of vital relation that goes past containment into a domain of relational excess. The punctum, then, is a kind of subtle beyond. To me, the girl in the photograph is a gesture to the parts of my grandmother's life that remain in quiet, that are unknowable and lost. Not just indexes of loss, however, because also the things that she could keep to herself and for herself. When Christine invited me to speak with you today, she asked me to speak specifically about a chapter from my book, Erase So Different, in which the Japanese-American concentration camps of World War II were a central focus. In that chapter, I focused on the scrapbook photographs of Moriyuki Shimada, a young man detained at Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. As a performance studies scholar, I was interested in the photographs as more than just documents of this particular historical tragedy. I was interested in the way that a photograph comes alive and performs for and with a spectator, allowing a viewer to touch or sense, touch on or gain a sense or feeling of Japanese Americanness that could not be contained by the dominant narratives of the camps. That is, I found in Shimada's photographs that complex mesh of feelings and experiences that can't be captured in a narrative of Japanese Americanness that reduced Nikei experience to the mere fact or trauma of the camps. And I was thinking about this in relation, this very question with a student yesterday, Ethan Fukuda, who was also sort of trying to imagine how we think Japanese Americanness when it is always routed back into the camps. What I was looking for were the everyday affects of being with each other within extraordinary historical circumstances, caring, loving, laughing, fighting, shivering, holding, and touching. Encountering the Shimada scrapbook, it was as if I was brushing up against and touching feelings and forms of Japanese American life that exceed and go well beyond the limits of the barbed wire, a kind of subtle beyond, to use the language of Bart, that emerged somewhere in the intersection between love and loss. Now for Bart, a photograph is bound up with the dynamics of loss and even grief, since in photography, a photograph is always a reference to something that once was. In photography, I can never deny that the thing has been there, but by its very nature, the moment having passed is not any longer. When Bart writes that every photograph is a certificate of presence, one finds a resonance between photography and performance. When performance studies scholar Peggy Phelan famously and contentiously observed that performance's only life is in the present, she insisted that a document of performance is something other than a performance. It is an index of the referent or the thing that has been there, just as it is proof that that thing is no longer and has receded from presence. To look onto a photograph is, as Bart described it, to view that moment that can never be again. So just as performance, when its only life is in the present, is constantly dying as it becomes itself, Bart understood photography to be an encounter with death. With the photograph, he wrote, we enter into flat death. In Bart's mind, it was this relation with death that made photography of all the arts the most like performance. If photography seems to me closer to theater, it is by way of a singular intermediary, and perhaps I am not the only one who sees it, by way of death. Where theater from antiquity to the present has been the mediator between the realm of the living and the dead, the photograph itself was the flattening of life into death. A photograph is marked by a withdrawal of presence, and thus serves as a reminder of death's inevitability. Whether or not the subject is already dead, wrote Bart, every photograph is this catastrophe. Now, Bart wrote Camera Lucida in the grips of personal loss. The book is divided into two parts. In the first, he focuses on the formal and affective dimensions of photography, but in the second, he reveals the personal reason he is doing so. Bart, our patron saint of melancholic and not quite out of the closet, but totally obvious homosexuality, lived with and adored his mother, Henrietta Bart, until her death in 1977. For the years following her death, as he was preparing to write Camera Lucida, this sweet and doting mama's boy kept a diary of his grief, one in which he meditates on photographs of his lost mother. In the second section of Camera Lucida, he begins by digging through photographs of her, admitting, I had no hope of finding her. Nonetheless, he was still searching for something that might allow him to hold on to the fading parts of her. I never recognized her except in fragments, he notes of the photos, snatching at those fragments still to pull some part of her back from the receding abyss. But he wants more than just fragments. My grief wanted a just image, an image which would be both justice and accuracy, just an image, but a just image. And then he stumbles on a photograph of her at 5 years old in a winter garden in 1898. Such, for me, was the winter garden photograph. Finding her in the image, he gives himself up to the image, which might also be to say that he gives himself over to the profound implications of her loss. When I confronted the winter garden photograph, I gave myself up to the image repertoire. Once more using the language of performance, this image repertoire is characterized by the following sequence. An encounter with a photograph allows him to time travel, reanimating his lost loved one, only to deliver him to the renewed and unbearable realization that she is in fact still gone. The encounter with a photograph for Bart is a confrontation with loss itself. In what follows, I want to try and tell the story of my winter garden photograph, which is also a story about love and loss, to constitutive affects, to a kind of Japanese American way of being that lives beyond the limits of barbed wire, included exclusion, colonization, and war, while being tethered to and inflected by all these many histories that still hurt. What follows is less an argument than a meditation in 3 acts on 3 photos, each focusing on a photo marked by the circuits of love and loss in Japanese America. Photograph 1, Tatsuko and Cleo with an unknown girl. It is not in the photograph of my grandmother that my grandmother's truth is revealed to me. Rather, it is the unknowability of the photograph that makes it a just image of her to me. I know my grandmother's face as well as my own, but I do not fully recognize her in this image. I know that it is her, but she seems someone else. And it is this gap between my profound sense of closeness and intimacy and the wide ocean of things that I do not know about her that makes it a just photograph of her. She was always at the center of our lives, the rock of our family, just as she was a mystery to us. But here is what I know. Tatsuko Chambers was born, Takano Tatsuko, in Kobe, Japan, March 15, 1930. She was the eldest daughter of a housemaid and a cook in the Japanese Imperial Navy. At 8:16 a.m. on August 6, 1945, she was reborn a hibakusha, a survivor of the atomic bomb. How did she get from Kobe to Hiroshima? Her childhood home of Kobe was spared the worst of the war, but shortly after her birthday in March of 1945, Allied forces unleashed bombs across the city. As a girl, Tatsuko barely knew her father, who was stationed in occupied Manchuria. The crimes committed by the Japanese military during its colonial period in China, Korea, and other parts of Asia, cruelly named the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, were appalling, and I shudder to think what her father witnessed, or worse, took part in. Tatsuko would never know. She met him only once before he died of malaria when she was a girl. Her mother, Tokie, was left alone to raise their 3 children. Tokie was originally from Hiroshima Prefecture, but had the ill luck of being born the second of identical twins. This was thought to be a bad omen, and she was exiled from her family at birth. A few months after the bombing of Kobe, and with nowhere to go home to, Tokie packed up her almost teenage daughters and infant son to take shelter from the war in her childhood home in Etajima, an island off the coast of Hiroshima City. About 10 or so days after they arrived, Tokie sent her eldest daughter across the bay to stay in the home of a paternal relative and retrieve some packages from a station on the outskirts of the city. Early on the morning of the 6th, a massive boom filled the air. Unsure of what was happening, Tatsuko and her relatives poured out into the street. After, she told me, the cloud was like a mushroom. It was so beautiful, and it just kept coming. Beautiful. And then silence, and then the duration that came after. Later, in the days and weeks after the bomb, Tatsuko made her way back into the city and sat across from an uncle whose skin had melted away from parts of his face in the heat of the blast. She looked at the exposed meat of her cousin's arm and the kimono patterns now permanently seared into her aunt's flesh. One wonders what she saw as she walked to find them. There are reports of bodies floating in the bay, in rivers and streams, flung there by their former inhabitants who jumped into the water to cool, searing flesh. They had nowhere to go, and some were doubly tortured by water that was boiling. After the bomb, Tatsuko set out to return to her mother. It took a day on foot to reach the bay, where she piled into a small fisherman's boat with a dozen other people trying to make their way to Etajima. A handsome young soldier sat across from her and asked her, "Where are you going?" When she said her mother's name, Takano Tokie, he recognized in Tatsuko the daughter of a childhood friend and spent the rest of the day guiding her home to her mother's arms. She never saw him again. Her mother, Tokie, died under mysterious circumstances a number of years after the bomb, and you can't help but ask if this was the effect of the radiation. Tatsuko was left to support her brother and sister. 5 years after the war, Tatsuko left Hiroshima to find work to send money back home to her siblings. The colonizers having become the colonized, during the occupation, US military bases were popping up across the archipelago, so she joined the swelling ranks of laborers pooling around the bases. She found a job in a seamstress's shop in Yokosuka, and one day, A handsome young Marine with a penchant for singing gospel walked through the front door. He could not speak Japanese. She barely knew English. But in the days and weeks that followed, he'd return, sometimes tearing his clothing for an excuse to spend more time with her. Their identical twin daughters, Sharon and Shirley, were born on November 5th, 1954. If you look at their birth certificates, you'll notice that the date of Tatsuko's marriage comes after their birth. It is a surprising detail given the conservative sexual mores of the parties involved. The race of the twins is listed as Negroid and Hmong. The reason their parents were not legally married when they were conceived is because a white consular officer refused to issue a marriage certificate for, in his words, a nigger to marry a Jap. Even in her 80s, Tatsuko would refer to her baby brother as Mai Haruhiko, but she would not see him again for decades after marrying Cleo, because after she and her husband finally secured their marriage, a distant male relative exiled her for marrying a Black American. Why, one could ask, would she give up her family to marry a gaijin, or foreigner? I can't fully know, but I wonder if the answer has something to do with the fact that both Shio and Cleo were strangers in their own countries. In an essay on the work of hibakusha novelist Hayashi Kyoko, dancer Otake Eiko writes, "It was difficult for hibakusha to get married, find jobs, or receive government assistance. Society was unsympathetic to hibakusha, who were already ill with atomic bomb disease, or destined to become so. The visible suffering of hibakusha were more or less localized to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and hibakusha who lived elsewhere often kept their hibakusha status a secret. But Tatsuko did not have to keep her hibakusha status a secret from her husband. He was a Black man from Jim Crow, Oklahoma. When he was a teenager, Cleo escaped a lynch mob with his brother Cliff. He knew well what it was to live in a world that is unsympathetic, if not violently hostile to the fact of one's existence and one's body. There is a Blackness to hibakusha and vice versa. Each living in their own wake, it made sense that they should find each other and build a world together. They had 4 daughters in all: Sharon, Shirley, Carmen Jean, and Sonia. Tatsuko could not pronounce the names of the first 3, so Shirley became Shadi, Sharon became Sharon, and Carmen Jean, Jeannie. When the twins were a few years old, Tatsuko and Cleo migrated to the United States, staying with his family in Colorado for a year before setting out to build a life in California. Their first night on the road, they stopped in a motel with a vacancy sign. The clerk took one look at their family, and suddenly the vacancy vanished. Tatsuko and Cleo slept in the car with their girls, and the motel charged them for the use of the parking space. They arrived in California, where they'd spent weeks calling ahead to make sure that apartments were available. When they arrived to see them, most landlords took one look at her husband, and suddenly the vacancies vanished. Their girls grew up. Tatsuko helped support the family with work in a Boeing factory for most of her adult life in the US, forging a circle of friends with the other Japanese immigrant women working the production line. Her twins were the first on either side of the family to attend college, and eventually she gained 2 grandchildren, a son from her oldest daughter and a son from her youngest. 55 years after the bomb, Tatsuko sat in a San Bernardino diner across from the eldest grandson. "I thought I was so smart marrying a rich American," she said. "But when I came to America, I found out that I married a Black man." The next year, on September 11th, 2001, I watched the Twin Towers fall from a street corner in Queens as a 21-year-old, making its own beautiful and horrible cloud of smoke. The phone lines went down throughout New York City, but Tatsuko spent the day calling to get through to me, and when she finally broke through, this is what she said: "Now you know what a war is like." I didn't really, but I came to know what it smells like, a mixture of burning flesh and buildings that lingers in the air for months. 65 years after the bomb, Cleo developed advanced Alzheimer's, and Tatsuko couldn't care for him on her own. She put him in a home, but just a few blocks away, as she moved in with her eldest daughter, Sharon. For a decade, she'd visit him every day, terrified that he would forget her, and maybe he did, but she loved him with the fullness of her heart, no less. Memory is a burden, but being forgotten is a curse. She visited him like that until they reached their late 80s. Her heart began to falter, and the daily trips became shorter and fewer between though her daughters went daily in her place. And then, in her 89th year and his 90th, as the coronavirus spread across the planet, sending the world into the lockdown, the family decided to move him back home with her and her daughter, where they put him in a sunny room. Once more, Tatsuko made her daily trek across the home to sit at his side as he drifted in a cloud of forgetting. "It's like the wartime again," she said to me in those early months of the quarantine. "Which was worse?" I asked. "In the war," she said, "you could go outside and see other people." Photograph 2, Sid and Mary. As she said this, I thought about the isolation and immobility of the concentration camps. People could go outside in the camps, it is true, but only as far as the barbed wire, and the isolation was palpable. When writing my first book, I had shown her the pictures of people in the camps like this one. She mused at how fashionable they looked. She liked their style. When I asked her what she thought about the fact that the US government put people like us in camps on the basis of race, she shrugged. "Wartime," she said. That one word for her was not an excuse for, but a matter-of-fact explanation for any number of atrocities that were unthinkable to us: atomic bombs, brutal colonial occupations, and concentration camps. One of the photographs that I showed her, my favorite, has a similar kind of matter-of-factness about the profound loss, but also love that characterized life under such conditions. It is a portrait of that subtle kind of beyond that I have been describing for Japanese American life, one that is characterized by a sense of care and touch from within the terrain of social death that the camps were becoming. The image is unremarkable. At 2.5 by 3.5 inches, it is a simple picture of a young couple seated on wooden steps leading up to a barrack door. She's wearing a white button-up dress that rides just beneath her knees, and her hand is placed heavily on her lap. Her feet are cropped from the image, and her hair is perfectly fashioned in the style of the era. The materials of the barrack behind her look cheap and shoddy. Her counterpart looks like a Nisei Clark Kent. There is an air of sadness to both of their expressions, and he is leaning his frame just slightly away from hers. In turn, her smile curls into a semi-amused near frown. Her body is parallel with his, leaning towards him, head cocked slightly in his direction. Offsetting the slight distance between them, her left hand reaches behind his right arm into the space between his legs. His left hand just delicately curls into hers. Again, I found my punctum, the place where their hands curl into each other. The touch, a subtle performance of sustenance and care from within conditions of isolation and deprivation. When I set out to write about the Japanese American concentration camps in World War II, I had initially begun writing about the photographs of the camps taken by famed photographers Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams, attending to their documentary effect. But for all that they could document, something was missing. Their images, especially Adams's, lacked the affective signature I was looking for, or, to be more precise, their affective signature was charged with a kind of whiteness, and I was looking for some other sense of Japanese America. Lange's images offered searing portraits of the process through which Japanese Americans were stripped to conditions of exposure and civic death, an effect that led to the impounding of some of the images. And I should say that Lange also had deep ties to the Japanese American community vis-a-vis her life in San Francisco, so much so that when one of the families that she knew got out of incarceration, they came and moved back in with her and her husband for a couple of months until they could get back on their feet. Adams's images, in turn, are distressingly aestheticized, papering over the violence of the camps by painting them as ideal patriotic communities. And I have a ton of shit to talk about Ansel Adams in these photos, if anyone wants to during the Q&A. What I was looking for was a trace of that other subtle kind of beyond that characterized love and loss in Japanese America, exceeding and going out beyond the interpolating forces of nationalism, as well as the limits of the barbed wire that were installed by the forces of white supremacy and anti-Asian animus. We have today a rich visual archive of life in the camps. Visual media, including photography and film, were used for propaganda purposes, as the WRA employed white photographers like Lange and Clem Albers and filmmakers to document the relocation efforts in camp life. In order to ensure that the images people saw were of a voluntary process, the US government banned all photographers from documenting the camp's military elements, including guards, weapons, guard towers, and barbed wire. Most camps banned Japanese Americans initially from owning their own imaging equipment and taking photographs. But in the early days of the wars, many Japanese Americans sneaked contraband imaging equipment into the camps. Eventually, Japanese Americans like Shimada, this is one of his images, were allowed to take photographs, but the ban on photographing any of the military installations remained in effect throughout the war. And something that I track in detail in the book are all of the ways in which Shimada sort of clandestinely takes images that capture the military installations. So if you look to the left of this chorus line of young women, this photo was taken on the day of Obon, which is the sort of festival of the dead. Festival, it's not really a festival, but well, it is actually. And to the left, you can see a guard tower there. Beyond serving as a remarkable record of vibrant life worlds that Japanese Americans created in the camps, Shimada's scrapbook contains a number of photographs that evidence the photographer's defiance against the ban on photographing the camp's military installations. He staged photographs in which subjects performed scenes that are bursting with assimilated national conformity, gender normativity, and ideality, functioning as a kind of camouflage to take these clandestine images. So shots of young men playing basketball with a guard tower in the background, crowds lining up to go to the movies with a guard tower in the background, or a group of young women posing as if they were a Broadway chorus line with a guard tower in the background. But my favorite has always been the portrait of Sid and Mary. I cannot help but see this image as a humble document of the everyday acts of care that pass quietly between people of color in the often hostile environment of this country. Subtle, easily missed performances such as these are largely absent from or overlooked within the popular and official records of Japanese American life in the United States. But the brush of Mary's skin against Sid's is irrefutable proof of the acts of tenderness that are shared between us, despite the ways in which we may be hurt, or the terrible and violent historical conditions under which our relationships develop. I want to be clear that I'm not making any assumptions about their actual relationship. It doesn't matter to me how well they knew each other. What matters is that here, in this moment, they touch. What leaps out from this picture is a touch that can be powerful, tender, and life-affirming, whether shared by passing strangers or the oldest of friends. They are touching not in spite of the camps, but within them. They express attachment through touch, which pushes back against the constrictions of the barbed wire and reroutes the racializing forces of the states. The sadness in their smiles reminds us that not all wounds come at the end of a gun, but sometimes through an act of law or the indifference of a nation. And still, there is the simple and everyday beauty of one person brushing up against another, loving the other, holding his or her hand, even in a place structured by exclusion, grief, and isolation. Photograph 3, Seasons of Glass. My grandfather died on August 26th, 2020. He died quietly and peacefully. And the night he died, he came back to visit my grandmother. Daddy came to me last night, she told my mother and her sisters, and she was sure to include this detail. I asked him to take me with him. She wasted little time. That night, Oba-chan had a small heart attack and began the process of slipping away from us. That process lasted for a month and a half. Later, my aunt called to tell me that Oba-chan had accidentally broken her teapot, the same teapot we had watched her brewed oi-cha in from her entire adult life. Seeing the broken pot, my aunt was sure that Obaba was going to die. As the fall began, rates of COVID infection began to surge in the region of Southern California, and the household returned to the strictest isolation. The quiet and loneliness was hard on my grandmother. Her decline was slower and less peaceful than my grandfather's, lasting a month and a half. In the grips of the unthinkable knowledge that we were losing her, I began to reach out desperately to hold on to any fragments that might keep her here with us. And strangely, I found one of those fragments in the work of an artist who could not have been more unlike my Oba-chan, Yoko Ono. Except that the more that I thought about them, the more I realized that they had in common. For one, they were of the same generation, a generation we lose today, and they traced similar roots of diaspora. Ono was born in Tokyo just a few years after my Obachan on today, February 18th, 1933. Where Obaba was the daughter of a cook and maid, Ono was the daughter of an influential banker. Obaba grew up looking for scraps of food for her siblings in neighbors' trash bins, and Ono went to the finest schools with the nation's aristocracy. But both were displaced by war. Tokie's fateful relocation of the family to Hiroshima province to escape the bombing of Kobe and Ono's family's reduction to living in the country, financially diminished, to escape the firebombing of Tokyo. And it was more than just the war that made the two resonate. Both were kinds of iconoclasts born into a world that was in the violent throes of remaking itself, born into a world that had little space for women like them, and born into a world in which they were inheritors to the unforgivable colonial violence of the Japanese imperial state and the military imperialism of the US government. Ono wanted to be a composer, but her father discouraged her from such work, so she pursued philosophy at Gakushuin University, the first femme in the program, before becoming an artist and a central pioneer in the emergence of performance art during the 1960s. Her work is often contemplative and meditative, and she designed many of her early works as instruction pieces in which a person could embody a set of instructions, inviting them to dream or fly or even imagine. And I should note that this emphasis on imagine has everything to do with the fact that Ono co-wrote the song Imagine with John Lennon, but wasn't given a credit. And he only admitted that she co-wrote the song years later. These instruction pieces were similar to the scores of John Cage, with whom Ono collaborated and to whom Ono introduced to Japan, underscoring Ono's continued interest in music and composition. And after a decade of producing a body of rich visual and performance art, Ono turned primarily to making music during the 70s and 80s, not actively exhibiting her visual work from 1971 until the mid-1990s. Her turn to popular music was facilitated in part by her infamous relationship with musician John Lennon. I'm wary of an overemphasis on Lennon in the telling of Ono's story. As far as I'm concerned, the best thing about John Lennon was that he had the good sense to marry Yoko Ono, and we could kind of end it there. I often point out to students when teaching about Ono that they met not because Lennon was famous, but because Lennon came to her show because it was she who had become the cause célèbre of the London art world after the release of her classic, controversial, and temporarily banned film, Butts, which is, as the title indicates, a film of butts. If Ono was blamed by a racist and misogynistic dominant culture for breaking up the Beatles, one could more seriously argue that it was less that Ono had a negative impact on Lennon's career than the fact that he had a profoundly deleterious effect on hers. The effect of their celebrity made it difficult for her to be taken seriously as an artist for decades, and even today she is commonly surfaced as a joke, despite having been one of the most influential forces in contemporary and performance art, and arguably the mother of punk rock. On the night of December 8th, 1980, Ono and Lennon were walking home from the studio where she was recording a new album. They'd just wrapped the track Walking on Thin Ice, to which Lennon contributed guitar. As they came upon their home, the famed Dakota building on the Upper West Side, a man approached them and shot Lennon twice. Her husband was still gripping the master track from her song as he bled to death in front of her. Years later, at an exhibition in New York City, Ono created an installation in which she installed a bundle of crumpled and bloody clothing that Lennon had been wearing when he was shot, putting them in a vitrine still sealed in the plastic police bag in which they were given back to her. While staring on the sculpture, a friend looked to me and said, "It must have been so hard to have loved someone so much and to have been hated so much for that." Loss transforms a person. Barth described this transformation in the bleakest of terms after the undoing of being that threatened him following the loss of his mother. It is said that mourning by its gradual labor slowly erases pain. I cannot believe this, because for me, time eliminated the emotion of loss. I do not weep. That is all. For the rest, everything has remained motionless. For what I have lost is not a figure, the mother, but a being. And not a being, but a quality, a soul, not the indispensable, but the irreplaceable. I could live without the mother, as we all do sooner or later. but what life remained would be absolutely and entirely unqualifiable, without quality. Life would end shortly after for Bart when he was hit by a laundry van while walking home through the streets of Paris in February of 1980. He died a month later. I agree with him that mourning does not erase pain so much as the loss just settles into those who are left behind. It becomes still and motionless. But I am less convinced that life must be absolutely and entirely unqualifiable after loss. The story of Japanese America and the three trajectories that I've mapped today tell us something about this. Rather than Bart's depressive and melancholic trajectory towards death and non-being, the final photograph I want to discuss tells a specific story about the relationship between love, loss, and living on in Japanese America. After Lennon's death, Ono completed the album and released Seasons of Glass a year later in June of 1981. Walking on Thin Ice was left off the track list, which is instead full of portraits from Ono's years of mourning, telling the story of a woman in her mid-40s raising a son alone and navigating the loss of her love with songs like Goodbye Sadness and Toy Boat, where she dreams of acceptance and a being beyond shattering. The cover to the album features a photograph of the view from the window of their apartment overlooking Central Park. The park and the towers of the Upper East Side are blurred in the background, but in the foreground are two objects atop a surface, a glass of water, either half full or half empty, and the glasses Lennon was wearing the night he was shot, blood splattered and dried across the lenses. Juxtaposing these two items, a cliched question as to whether the glass is half full or empty is transformed into a meditation on the violent force of loss, grief, shattering, and what it is to live on in the wake of such things. If Seasons of Glass speaks of a kind of shattering, we are also presented with the image of two fragile objects that are made of glass and nonetheless haven't been broken. Glass is itself the product of traumatic conditions, as sand is melted to liquid form in a forge before being given new shape, motionless, still, yet carrying within it the trace of the forge's fire. Vulnerable perpetually to the violent undoing that shattering threatens, but also solid, beautiful, and transparent. A portrait of grief, vulnerability, and potential, the image is a gentle reminder of the co-constitutive relationship between loss and love. One knows great loss because one has known great love. During the month and a half that my Obachan was leaving us, it was the waiting that was the most unbearable. I listened to Seasons of Glass on a kind of macabre loop, and then on the morning of October 19th, 2020, I woke with a start. I opened my eyes as I had every morning for weeks, and my mind raced to her side. And just 2 minutes later, a text came through from my mother. Tatsuko had gone home to her husband, Cleo, and her mother, Tokie. Both of my partners were still asleep in bed beside me. I left them there, walked quietly across the apartment in the dawning light to light incense and chant a sutra about the passage into nothingness, the cessation of suffering, and the awakening that comes after loss. I concluded there, and I conclude there today with this passage from the Heart Sutra. In nothingness, there is neither ignorance nor extinction of ignorance, neither old age and death nor extinction of old age and death, no suffering, no cause, no cessation, no path, no knowledge, and no attainment. Gone, gone, gone over, gone fully over, awakened. So be it. Thank you. Okay, and I'm gonna adjust my light because the sun went down and I now look like a vampire. Okay. You're muted, Christine.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that. Yeah, that meditation on all levels. So folks, if you have questions or any kind of reactions, Please feel free to either leave them in the chat or I think under reactions, you can hit raise hand and ask your question personally. And I see Professor Karen Hyman's hand up.
I wanted to start off by just saying, thanking you, Josh, for that really beautiful moment, right? And the sharing of that. I think it's doing so much, and it's thinking about it in relationship to our current moment, but our current moments, right? These ongoing moments of loss and constant moments of sort of violence, in particular that bodies of color have to navigate. There were a couple of things that just stood out to me, right? The engagement with photography, the engagement with images of loss, but also of what could be, of what is, right? Like we always get something different, right? Like your engagement with the punctum and the hand and affection for me was particularly moving. And I kept thinking about that image rather than the hand holding, but the fleck of hair that's on there. That's just sort of the tenderness. And it's how it's like, oh, lovers often like, let me brush that off your forehead. Just the anticipation of what could be at that moment, right? Like what happens after the picture. But also in thinking about sort of some of the students that are on the call and the question of methodology, right? Like, yes, we're thinking about it as a meditation, but I think you also demonstrated the possibilities of what critical writing could look like, right? It isn't devoid of feeling. It could actually be full of feeling. It could actually be a way to engage with personal experiences and personal reflections in ways that actually do something, right? It's yes, it's a moment of coming together in community, but all critical writing doesn't have to look, sound, or feel a particular way. And I thought that you did that so beautifully, bringing us into that moment, but also giving us something to feel, but also to think, right? And I just wanted to know if you could say a little bit about your methodological approach in navigating that, right? Moving from, I'm feeling this, I'm going to share this. Now let's think about how, you know, like you're bringing in Bart's, you're bringing like all of these conversations going in at once. So that was my little moment.
No, thank you, Karen. That was really generous. Thank you. I'll work my way back a little. The question of feeling and thought have never been, I was about to lie to you. I was about to say the question of thought, feeling and thought have never been separate to me, but that's actually not true. I think for a very long time, I really intensely partitioned feeling from thought, which is, I'm a Virgo and I'm prototypically Virgo, and that's a very Virgo thing to do, right? We sort of, Bjork has a line like, I thought I could organize freedom, how Scandinavian of me. And like, you know, I thought I could organize feeling, how Virgo of me. And so, you know, as scholars, I think we're often, and I'm speaking abstractly here, but scholarship within the sort of framework of Western epistemology, within the framework of the academy, the discourses of objectivity, right, and rationalism and reason that structure scholarship are really, really drilled into students. And you and I and Christine all had, I think, the benefit of being in a very weird discipline, performance studies, and training with very weird people. And the discipline forced us to sort of think methodologically in a different way, which is that I mentioned earlier that Phelan gives us this definition of performance as that which is always slipping away from us, right? And we can argue about that, and we do, and debate that. But there's something about performance as an object of analysis that you can never quite hold on to, right? And so, you know, you can't really have a kind of objective way of analyzing something that has slipped away from you because the evidence isn't around anymore, right? And so one has to develop other methods for approaching that. And the field of performance studies has, I think, explored lots of really extraordinary methods for doing that, right? There's the ethnographic approach where one really goes in and embeds oneself in a community and learns and elevates that community's stories. But one of the ways I think we were trained, and this is the second part, is, you know, our teacher, Jose Munoz, was deeply invested in feeling and in affect. And feeling and affect were only divided in thought because Western epistemology told us those things were separated, right? But I don't think we were ever asked to do that. So even though when I was a grad student and writing my first book, I was very much in my sort of Virgo emotions are separate things space, I couldn't help but gravitate towards feeling. And the chapter in the first book, which is about the photographs, I think is probably my most sort of hippie weird chapter in that book, because a lot of that book is close analysis of the legal and doctrinal history of the sort of making of Asian Americans, right? But then I turn to these aesthetic objects in which we have a different kind of relationship to these things. And in the chapter on the Shimada photographs, like rational analysis kind of goes out the window, and I really start describing my affective relationship to these images while also trying to place them in the context of the concentration camps. So that leads me to what, like maybe about 6 years ago, after that book comes out, and another kind of major loss happened, which was the loss of our teacher. The same year that Jose died, one of my best friends also died, committed suicide in January, and then Jose died in December. So those two losses were just shattering. And at that point, I was overwhelmed by the feeling. So I could no longer keep the feeling at bay or even organize it, right? And I wasn't going to be able to survive it. It was drowning me. So I had to put it somewhere. And the place that I put it somewhere was in the writing. When I started writing and just forgiving myself the indulgence of letting the feeling guide the thinking, I found that one, because that's not what you're supposed to do, and people will tell you constantly, like, that's not what you're supposed to do. Like, once you're breaking the rule, it's like, all right, fuck it, I'm gonna do what I want, right? So once I did that, I feel like, it freed me up a little bit, and I actually think that the thinking got better, because what became very clear to me is that feeling is, right? Feeling is not just thought, it is the material, right? It is our encounter with our objects. It is the way that we know the things that we relate to and we think about. And so ever since then, I would say that the very first thing I think when I sit down to write is, what is the feeling I'm trying to catch? And then I go from there. And it doesn't mean that I can trust the feeling, but that also can lead to really, powerful analytic relationships, because sometimes our feelings guide us into places. They take us down dirty roads that can actually lead to really interesting sort of questions and thoughts. So I think I don't know if that answers the question. It didn't.
It totally answers the question. And I would just like to say, this version, the feeling Josh is very different than the Josh I first met, who was very,
I know, bound up.
Yeah, but I think that your engagement with feeling has made the writing and the work just so much richer, right? And both the affective connection and the theoretical connections, so lucid. And so, again, I just keep thinking, like, so beautifully sort of shared with us. So again, I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you, Karen. I would like a tiny little thing on the end of that, I'd say is, one thing is that grief and loss, you kind of either have to like make your peace with feeling, right? Or you fight it and then it fractures you and shatters you, right? It really is kind of like that glass that's resonating and it's either going to burst or whatever. So that was some of it. I was just like, the flood of feelings were such that the only way to survive them was, I said this to students all the time, don't become hard, right? Because students will say like, oh, I need to become hard so this doesn't hurt so much when I get a rejection letter. I'm like, don't become hard. I'm like, become like water, right? Have the feeling and let it flow in and through you, so that's well, I'll leave that there. Yeah.
Josh, I wonder if I could ask a kind of follow-up question that's related to Karen's, which is, and thank you again for kind of guiding us through the loss, both personal and the historical, right? And also just, again, kind of the ways in which you're able to, as you kind of theoretically lay out, right, really treat these photographs as performances, right? So in some ways, we become audience to them, and we also see your own kind of vision of them as an audience member. And then, of course, the ways in which you allow them, right, to lead you down kind of speculative roads or paths, right? But I wondered, in terms of again, kind of on the question of writing, and in particular, writing about events that in some ways, as you kind of mentioned, are the ways in which certain identities are routed, right? So again, Japanese Americanness through kind of concentration camps, right? We can think of other kind of instances in Asian America in terms of war and empire. And if you have any kind of notes or things that have helped you kind of work through it so as not to feel either overwhelmed, right, by the kind of history that's there, or feel that the writing becomes like stilted or overdetermined, right, by tropes or whatever other ways people have envisioned those histories, right? So
Yeah, no, that's huge. I mean, so in terms of the trope thing, like that's always huge. And this is always the risk about writing with affect, right? And actually, you know, on a very real level, I'm very conscious of the fact that like, I'm just going to say this, it's going to sound incendiary maybe, but like white people love consuming and drinking in people of color's fears and tears, right? Like, it's just like, that's sort of how the terror of white supremacy has worked, right? Which is like, there is pleasure in terrorizing us, and then there is pleasure in the affect that it produces in us when we're being terrorized. So I have been very conscious, the more that I have sort of thought and written with affect, about the risks that can come with that, right? And I think about that very specifically in relationship. I mean, there's a reason that today I was focusing on sort of touch and care and these kind of quieter affects in the camps, because I think that there is a tendency to want to see the stories of you know, profound depression and all of which are there. Like, it's not hard to find those in the camps, right? But all of those are there, and especially in the academy, which is a predominantly white space, I'm very conscious of the fact that I always know that I'm writing to other folks of color, and I'm like happy for the down white folk that want to come in the room, but like I know that I'm writing for other folks of color, but I'm also aware that like anytime you're writing, it becomes a commodity, and that commodity can become consumed, and feelings and the feelings of POC become consumed in very real ways, right? So there's that. Then there is attached to that, I think, something that you're gesturing to, which is just like how one actually does the work of going into spaces that are so affectively overdetermined, right? And navigating that and surviving that. And I think in some ways, like, I'm glad that I wrote the first book when I was still sort of emotionally bound up, because the first book is really like, I was joking with some students the other day where we were talking about my second book, which is, you know, about survival and mourning and beauty. And I said to them, I was like, you know, my first book was kind of like it's pretty bleak. Like, it's basically like, they're going to wind up your kids and put them in concentration camps, you know, right? Like, there's a lot of legal exegesis basically saying, and part of it was I was writing in the mid 2000s, and I was watching Guantanamo, and I was watching people saying, how could this happen, right? It almost feels quaint to say, how could Guantanamo happen after, you know, not just 4 years of what's been happening in concentration camps on the border, but, you know, now like what, we're 16 years. But I was watching that, and one of the things about looking at the legal apparatus that allowed the camps to happen was that it just became very clear to me, like, how could Guantanamo happen? Well, it makes sense. There's actually a legal record that will totally show you not only how it could happen, but how it could be legally justified, right? And that record goes back to before the instantiation of the country. And the thing about law, especially in a stare decisis system, is it's citational, right? So the managing of racial difference in the concentration camps, as you noted, right? They could be built on the land of sites of Native American reservations, right? Because there was an apparatus that allowed for that to happen, right? And I point this out to students all the time, like, name a point in this country's history where there has not been a concentration camp that are like holding racialized subjects. And by concentration camp, I mean that loosely, but like the prison industrial, like, just name a moment in the last 400 years where that hasn't been a case. Okay, so these are difficult things to think about and to write about. And I think as a scholar, on some level, the containment of the discourse of law and then the turn to the aesthetic allowed me to balance the actual deprivation of what it was to be researching the camps and be reading the stories of people that were shattered and destroyed. I briefly cite in the book the diary of a young kid named Stanley Hayami. And you'll notice if you read the book that when I write about the Shimada scrapbook, I barely say anything about his life. And there's a reason for that, and it's not good scholarship. What it was is that as I was doing the research for the book, I was learning so much about these people I was writing about, and I was reading this diary, which hadn't then been published. It has been since, but I was reading a diary in the archives of the Japanese American National Museum about this kid, Stanley Hayami, who was incarcerated at Manzanar as a high school kid. And you just, when you're in the archive and you're doing nosy work into people's lives, you fall in love with them. You start to feel for them. And at the end of the diary, it just stops. Like one day he just stops writing, right? And so you're like, oh, what happened, right? And so I did do some digging to find out. And what happened is that he was drafted into the US military and died in Italy a couple months after being drafted into the war. And it was maybe my first year of writing my dissertation, and I was just sort of devastated by it. Like I actually sort of, not like devastated, but I was grieving the loss of this person, because in my mind, I was like, I'm gonna find him. Like I'm gonna find where he is and seek him down today. And I couldn't. He was gone. And for that reason, I never tried to find out what happened to Moriyuki Shimada, because I didn't want to know, right? Like I didn't actually want to bear going through that again. And I was just willing to be a bad scholar, on that front. So some of thinking and researching and working on material that is really intense is you have to find ways to be able to structure it so that you can bear it. You have to know your limits and be able to move away from the things that you can't bear to know. And it also means being ethical about what you choose to disclose, right? That was one thing when I was writing about the camps, is that I was like, there is a massive archive of material on the camps. I refused to go and interview any survivors of the camps, because I just thought, like, I don't need to make my, career on that when there is such a huge body of oral histories. I mean, I spent hours listening to oral histories and reading the legislative records and whatever. So there was such a body of material that I didn't need to. That's not to say that it can't. You can do quite ethical ethnography in relationship to survivors, but I didn't. So there's that. And then, like, on the third register, so that you can kind of create safety valves to allow you to navigate the material, which may also mean like having an essay on the side that you're working on that is about joy, right? Having other projects that like you can turn to, right? That give you an out. And I would say, as the third thing, once I started to really think about affect as a central part of the research process, so more the type of work that I was presenting today, that was when I also started to have to actually do like real practices of self-care, right? Like around things like knowing that there's just a point where it starts to hurt and you have to sort of recognize that. So for this particular talk, once I'd spoken with you and agreed, like, okay, this is going to in part address my grandmother, which is, her loss is something that I have not really been able to speak about. It's just been kind of, there's no words. That I had to spend the last month prepping for that and writing a little bit a day and then going to other things. And then when I find myself being foul and mean to my partners, it's because I'm like, oh, it's because I'm hurting because I miss her. So like, let's go work on that pile of administrative emails that is always, dragging me down, right? But just to say, like, sometimes the essay doesn't need to be written. Now, if you are trying to get tenure, that may not be a project to pursue, right? Like maybe you do that after tenure when you can stretch it out over 5 years to be able to survive it, right? Like there are choices that you can make about it, but it's just to say, to find ways to actually be able to bear your own feelings. I don't know if that was a very meandering answer, Christine. I'm sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I like meandering with you, Josh.
Okay.
Joe Miranda has a question.
Hi, thank you so much. This really beautiful talk, and I just want to echo what like everyone else has been saying. And now my question feels really modest and small compared to these bigger things, but something that kind of, I think, which is related to, I think, what we were just saying about this question of disclosure, something that I felt while I was watching and looking at the images you chose for us, specifically of the camps as well as the Yoko Ono cover, was in comparison to the two images of the white photographers that you showed, was just sort of this like blurring and this movement between loss and love that you're talking about. And I was just wondering if you wanted to, this question of focus, and both as one, I think what I'm seeing is both like a furtive like strategy to like get information out to go against what I'm seeing if you could tell me if you're right, which is like, what is the nation trying to convince us with like an emphasis on documentary realism in the photographs? But also, obviously, I think something more about softness, intimacy, proximity that I think you were drawing us to. And I was wondering if you wanted to just speak more about like how you went about picking the photograph that you showed us today.
That's great. So I'm gonna not answer that last question until the end of this, right? The how I went about the photographs, and answer a different question that was sort of embedded in there, right? Which is this question about the blurring and disclosure, right? And the difference, in part because I was like, I planted the seed. I wanted to talk shit about Ansel Adams, so now I get to do it, right? And then I can get to that sort of final thing about how I chose the photograph. So, you know, like I said, when I first started out, I was working on the dissertation. Part of it is, you know, I was writing about the camps. I was writing about all sorts of stuff in the camps. One of the chapters is on performances of patriotism. I was just like, there's a ton of patriotic performance in the camps. And like, you know, how do we account for that? And so I was looking for documentary material about that. And I found tons of home videos from the camps. But I also found out that Ansel Adams had taken all of these photos of the camps, right? And I should also note that all of this begins with Christine. I was actually taking my doctoral exams and I was writing an essay about the legal structure of the camps. And Christine was like, you need something aesthetic and material there. And she's like, what about those photos you're always talking about? And so in my like qualifying examination, I started writing about the photos, and that became a chapter, which then became a book. And now here we are. So Christine really gets co-author credit. But when I discovered these Ansel Adams photos, the first thing is, I loved them. Because I had just never seen such beautiful photos of Japanese Americans in the 1940s. Like, that's what I loved about them, is that they were just these beautiful photos of like people just being fabulous, right? And I was sort of disturbed because I was like, they're so beautiful in a concentration camp. And Ansel Adams's photography, he was a naturalist. And then the images very much, they are beautifully well-made images, right? And the best images in the mix are the portraits of people, because they're these up close portraits of people's faces, and they, as the performer for the image, are looking back at the camera, so you can read their performance in relationship to what Adams is doing. But there's still just this intense aestheticization of it, and it looks so ideal and is so beautiful. And you mentioned a kind of blur, and the Adams images are just crisp as fuck. Even that photo I showed you of the baseball game, it's like frozen perfectly in time. The nature pictorialist knows how to get his shot. Lang's images don't have that same degree of crispness that Adams has, right? They're a little bit more kind of on the fly, right? She had a kind of grittier aesthetic anyways. We know this from her WRA work. But they are also still well-made images in a lot of ways. And the two of them got into what the purposes of these images were at the time. So Lang was hired by the WRA to take the images. And she takes all of these images, and then they're like, you can't put these out. And they even impound some of them, right? So she's like, great, I can't get these images out. And she was desperate, because she was like, we need to get these in the newspapers. People need to see what's happening, right? Lang then was not hired by the government to take the photos. He was really good friends with the camp director at Manzanar, Ralph Merritt, who was also a member of the Sierra Club. Like, they were both nature lovers. So he gets this guy, he convinces him to let him have access to the camps. He even gets lodging and a studio in the camps, and goes into the camps and takes all of these images, right? And in a letter exchange I found in Adams's papers at UCLA, like Lang and Adams have this intense exchange where she is like, you need to get these photos in the newspapers. People need to know what is happening. And he delayed and he delayed. And the reason that he delayed is because he wanted to have a show at MoMA first with the images. So he delayed releasing the images for fully a year and a half so that he could have the show at MoMA. One of the, in the catalog for the show, the catalog essay is written by the Secretary of the Interior, who oversaw the incarceration. And Adams has an essay which has all this language about patriotic life in the camp. And the stuff that blew my mind was when I was in his archives, I found the copy of a speech given by Ralph Merritt in the camps to Japanese Americans in the camps about how their sacrifices and performances of patriotism were showing their true fidelity to the nation. And almost word for word, Adams lifted that language and used it in his essay, right? So you can imagine the deeper I got in with him, the more angry I got, but I didn't want to write a chapter in which I was just like tearing him, like it just wasn't interesting to me to write an essay about how Ansel Adams is a jerk. And while I was simultaneously doing this, I started at the Japanese American National Museums. I started finding all these archives of photographs and home video footage that Japanese Americans had taken, and I started learning more about some of the photographers that were in the mix. And the two photographers that I got most attached to were Shimada and Toyo Miyatake. And Toyo Miyatake had been a photographer in the sort of modernist scene in Los Angeles in the 1920s. He photographed the dance spectacles of Michio Ito, who was an Issei choreographer who was eventually kidnapped by the US government, disappeared into one of the War Department camps that were separate from the main 10 camps that we discussed. He was traded back to Japan in a war relocation exchange, a prisoner exchange. So his kids just never saw him again until they traveled to Japan as adults and found their dad, this photographer. And his photographs of the camps, and it makes sense because he was a dance photographer, they're just filled with not just sort of blurring, but the blur. Like when you look at a lot of his images of the camps, it's just people in motion. So you'll just see bodies moving. And it is this constant capturing of like a movement that can't be pinned down or stopped, right? And similarly in Shimada, you have all of these images of movement. You saw that image of the fire where there's just this kind of chaos, right? And that is what started to really draw me to them. And it's two different examples: an amateur photographer, Shimada, right, who is just capturing life in the camps, but it's these intimate textures, a softness to them, a kind of blur to them. And then in Miyatake's sense, a more formal attempt to take the image, but one that images the actual blur and movement in life itself. Whereas for Adams, and to some extent Lang, it really is about the good picture, which is about the sort of stilling of the scene. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is that Miyatake, after the camps, went on to do these amazing images of just dancers' bodies moving, where you can't tell that it's a body, you can't tell the movement. It's just this blur of whatever the light was capturing, which is just, someday maybe I'll be able to write about that. Also, his kids still have a photo studio in Los Angeles, or at least they did a couple of years ago. Then the last thing I'll say is how I picked these particular images. So that gives you a sense of how I came to the Shimada images to some extent. And the Yoko Ono image and the family images, the Yoko Ono image is just, the Seasons of Glass album cover has like blown my mind since I was a kid. Like when I figured out what it was, that it was his glasses, because I was just like, I mean, that lady is just hardcore. I mean, I just don't know how else to describe it, And so I literally, if I could turn my computer around, you would see that album is above the desk. I look at it all the time when writing. And so as I was starting I've written about that image of my grandparents in my last book, and I knew that that was going to be present. And then I started thinking about what the relationship between that image was to the Ono, and the rest just sort of kind of fell in place from there. Hopefully that answered the question. I see Brian, and I'm very bad at chats, but I noticed that there are some questions in the chat. So I'll
yes,
jump
but
to
Brian
those.
and I
But
have
Brian,
agreed his question will go first, and then I'll ask Thomas's as the last. So
perfect.
Yeah, I got you.
Thanks, bro.
Thanks so much for this conversation. As you know, I resonate greatly with the work, but also with the relationships. My own site being my family in a refugee camp in Thailand, and a photograph of them there in my most recent writings. And your conversation on glass and using affect and punctums really spoke to me as a way of breaking away from the tropes that we were talking about in terms of some of this documentarian writing that re-traumatizes our subjects. And so I wanted to talk about the different relationships of care, which you've been talking about throughout, between the photographer, the photographed, the author and the photograph, the author and the photographer, the author and those being photographed, which of course you in your in your last example of photographing one another, keepsaking one another, videoing and living with one another, was so prescient for me, as my photograph is of my grandmother. Yeah, I was hoping you could talk to more the forms of care as a scholar, as a son, as a grandson.
Yeah. You know, I think some of it is like, some of this will actually go back to the method question that Karen was asking. Because I also think, you know, if I was saying performance is an object that is always slipping away from us, we can also say that when we're studying forms of minoritarian life, when we're studying Black and Asian immigrant life, we're also dealing with forms of life that are under erasure, right, that have been erased from the archive, right? I mean, this idea, Hartman's work on what it means to go into the archive, right? An archive that is actually hostile to the existence of the very life world that one is trying to think with and about, means that one has to turn to other kinds of methods, right, for thinking in relationship to that archive, right? So there is the sort of form of fabulation that Hartman describes, and there's certainly a degree of fabulation in what I presented today. My mom and my auntie were here, and I was saying to Christine, I hope they don't unmute during the talk to correct me, right? And like, you know, certainly to unmute to correct me now. I'm not sure if they're still on the call. They might have pieced out, but you know, some of it was because, like, part of what I was gesturing at is what we know of our parents and our grandparents' stories are also not always commensurate. In fact, are very rarely commensurate with the truth, right? So much of what I was writing down are things that I have recorded in talking with her over the years. So much of the story was me going to her and saying, okay, tell me this detail, but also I'm 100% she lied about some of that stuff and didn't want me to know. And that's part of what I was also sort of like gesturing to. So when, you know, so much of our stories and histories are erased from the archive, as researchers, like I am, you know, kind of stuck on a blade, which is that on the one side, I don't want things to be lost to history. And then on the other side, I am afraid of that commodification thing that I was talking about earlier, right? Which is like, you know, who are we telling these stories for, and what are people going to do with them? And so, you know, I knew, and I have known for a long time, that whatever my grandparents were, they were extraordinary, and that history in this country would work very hard to make sure that they never existed. And that the one thing I could do is sort of like, you know, do the "this has been here" that Bart talks about, right? So it was really important to me when I was getting the last book published to make sure that the photograph that I talk about today is in that book, the photograph of my grandparents and the little girl. And it was one of my, I don't actually put the photo up here, but one of my favorite photos that I have is, as soon as the book was published, I drove over to my grandmother and took her the book, and I have a photo of her looking at the picture of her. And what you can't hear her then is looking at the picture of my aunt and saying, "You look fat." Like, while my aunt is sitting there and just being like, "We can't be nice to each other, can we?" Like, that's not something that we do in this family. So, you know, I guess this isn't really an answer. So much as saying you're always kind of walking on that blade. And I think what I try to set for myself as a kind of ethical standard is to speak to and with the people that I'm writing to and for. So I have to know who I'm writing for, and to speak to and with and for them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I abandon some of the forms of scholarly writing, right? Like, I might want to go down a Bart rabbit hole. I might want to just spend a lot of time really grappling with something that Hortense Spiller suggests, and really complex and nuanced language. And my mom doesn't want to hear that, right? So it doesn't mean abandoning, you know, some of those formal approaches, but that if I can translate some of those scholarly things, right, over to the people that I'm speaking with. It's not that it's necessarily going to make them happy, right? But can I do it in good faith that it is part of a conversation amongst and between us, you know? And then, like any kind of creative practice, and scholarship is a creative practice, you're going to fail sometimes, right? Sometimes you're going to write about the photograph and you're going to see somebody do something with it that is the opposite of what you want, right? One of the artists that I love to write about, Felix Gonzalez Torres, tells this story of putting a sculpture out where people can take the pieces of paper and seeing someone come into the gallery and take up all of this paper and feeling like, oh, that's wonderful. She probably needs the paper. Like, this is great. And then watching her walk in front of the gallery and crumple up the paper and shove it into a trash can publicly for everyone in the gallery to see. And the interviewer asked him, well, how did that feel? And he was like, well, it didn't feel good, right? So, you know, when you make something, it can go the wrong way, but you can't avoid that. So it's like, while you're walking on that knife's edge, you're kind of constantly questioning, who am I doing this for, right? You know, what am I doing this for? You're thinking about that question of audience, and then you're also knowing that you might have to forgive yourself if you fail, and that's the reason that you move on to writing the next thing in the hopes of not reproducing that failure. It's profoundly unsatisfactory, you know, especially given the conditions that we live and work and write under, but it's sometimes the most that you can do.
Thank you, Josh. So the last question from Thomas, which I think kind of speaks to a little of what you were saying at the end there, and that maybe if Thomas doesn't mind, I'm going to kind of also fine tune or extend in some ways. So Thomas writes that he's a music student. A degree program is actually called performance practice, which is a little puzzling to me. One thing I've been using over in my graduate studies is the idea of performance as research, as you just mentioned, or performances as scholarship. Hearing your talk or meditation, which you shared with us, was really eye-opening in this respect. And so if there's anything you want to add about or speak a little more about in terms of how you understand performance as research, or how performing, right, as scholarship. And then I also wondered too, I mean, thinking tonight, right, about your talk, that in many ways, it is not the kind of traditional, right, kind of academic talk, whatever that means. And so it, you know, but, or it doesn't fit within that genre, even though, of course, this part of the thing that we do is always also a performance, right? So yeah, if there's anything you want to speak on.
Sure. And I should note, my aunt and my mom are here. My aunt noted that in the.
Oh yes, yeah. Sharon's
yeah.
still here.
Yeah, the law of the mommy and the law of the auntie. And my mom, as you know, is an identical twin. So I have two mommies. It's a profound law, and I submit to that law. Okay, so performances research and yeah, okay. So, you know, the funny thing is, I teach in the Department of Performance Studies at Northwestern University, which has a real tradition of performance as a method of research. And includes, you know, a lot of my colleagues actually perform, like they you know, have a practice. And so when I was being interviewed for the job, I am like the opposite of that. I am like the nerd that wants books, you know, and pen and paper. Like that's all I need, and I'm happy, right? And actually, like I joke, but I'm 100% serious that the first book, one of the reasons it's like all stuff that happens in the past, right? Like the vast majority of it happened well before I was alive, was because I'm like terrified of people. And if I wrote about performances that happened in the past, I didn't really have to interact with people. And also, if I wrote about performances that happened in the past, I didn't even have to go see bad theater that would make me uncomfortable, right? Like I can write about the 19th century production of Madame Butterfly because I didn't have to sit through it. And it's not to say that I don't sometimes like a theater show. It's just that 9 times out of 10, I feel uncomfortable and I get sweaty palms and feel embarrassed for the people on stage because I'm like, you are a grown-ass person acting like, you know, like the Queen of Russia right now. Like, stop it, knock it off. I don't really mean that. So when I was being interviewed for my position at Northwestern 10 years ago, they actually asked, they asked me the performances research question. You know, how do you employ performance in your research? And I lied through my teeth. I think I said like, oh, in the classroom, I do sort of like mock trials. And, you know, and they like knew I was lying, but they hired me anyway. But it was, you know, an amazing environment to be working, where I was working with D. Soyini Madison and E. Patrick Johnson, Ramon Rivera Cervera, my colleagues who all really did engage with performance as a research method. And what I realized is that my sort of fantasy that I had no relationship to practice was one, but not because I was secretly an artist, right? It was more that like, and this goes back to some of our training, Christine and Karen, you know, like the way that Jose, and certainly the way in performance studies, often the way we engage with artists is not as objects of analysis, right? But like, when I write with artists, I mean, I write with them. I think of artists as theorists, right? So when you're reading something I've written, like Nina Simone is a theorist just as much as Karl Marx is. It's not that she's the person I write about, she's a person I write with, and her ideas animate my ideas. And often what I'm trying to talk about is what I learned from that person. So once the artist stops being an object of analysis, but sort of like an interlocutor, the boundaries between what research is, what performance is, start to get really sort of blurry, right? So that's one thing. Then attached to that, there's a lot. I'm also wants you all to know that my dad is also on the call. Attached to that, there's this really beautiful moment in a Hortense Spiller's essay that I was talking about with a grad student today, where she's talking about Fanon, and she just sort of says, there's a point where Fanon gets exhausted by clinical practice and its limits and has to turn to lyricism to say what he's trying to say, right? And when students are engaging with theory, in fact, this student who was reading Spiller's essay on psychoanalysis and race started by saying, it's so hard, like I felt like I was on the outside. And I was like, nobody says that about a poem or like a weird play, right? It's like, oh yeah, I didn't understand that Bjork song. Like nobody's like, I just really felt like I couldn't get in. It's sort of like either I don't like that, right? Or, whatever, but its difficulty is just understood to be part of the form. And I'm like, philosophy is like poetry. It's people playing with language. Theory is, scholarship can be a form of lyrical poetics. So the more that I embraced that, and the more that I realized that the theorists I loved in part because they turned to the lyric, Fanon and Spillers, right? Again, those boundaries between sort of performance and practice and research started to break down, right? And then I'd say the third thing is that working in my department, where I did work with folks that really placed an emphasis on performance, I started to just recognize that when you give a talk, like whether you like it or not, you're actually putting on it, you're performing. And actually as a teacher, it's the same thing. And I learned that first from my mother, who was the most amazing teacher. When I was a kid, I remember watching her, like she'd get dressed up for work and she'd put on her Athena costume. And it's like, why are you dressed like Athena? And she's like, I'm teaching Greek mythology today. Like, why wouldn't I be dressed as Athena, right? Or she'd be dressed as Queen Elizabeth, this like little Black Japanese lady dressed as Elizabeth I. And she's like, because I'm teaching about the Tudors today, right? So she really understood the classroom as like knowledge production as a site of performance. And I think, when we acknowledge that, then we can also sort of like settle into and acknowledge the fact that even when we're giving a talk, there's a kind of aesthetics to it. So I don't pretend necessarily to be a performer, but I try to think about the aesthetics, the cadence of the voice while you're talking, the way it attaches with the visual material. I think Zoom is hard because no one wants to sit and listen for 30 or 40 minutes, but I realize images are something that people can meditate on. But even like practicing to keep my voice steady so it's not hard to listen to if that's what you're doing, that kind of thing. So really I'd say the answer to it is I love the performance studies has really thought about how the aesthetic is also a way of learning and producing knowledge. And I've learned a lot from that. And I think that you can do that without claiming to be an artist if you're not, which I'm not. But then the last thing I will say, what starts to happen is your artist friends who are your interlocutors then start using you in their work. So like I've written a lot about the artist Jan Vo, and like Jan now has a kind of shtick where he'll like agree to give a talk with me as the interviewer, but then when we get up, he leaves the stage and he wants me to like read something about him, right? So, and it's like, and I realized at some point I was like, his work is a curatorial practice. I was like, I'm one of your objects now, aren't you? And that was like, and he was like, yeah, totally. And I'm like, oh, okay, right. So I became the object of my object. But I would just say that as those boundaries between what research is, what performance is, or what research and what the aesthetic is start to blur, we also start to learn in new and different ways. And I think that is one of the ways that people of color have always had to done because we have been excluded from the formal spaces of knowledge and research production, right? So we have often done our scholarship in our songs and in our movement, not just because we're innately singing and dancing people, but because we're resourceful and we have used the means that we have at our hand to produce knowledge, even when we are told that we have no history and no knowledge to add to the world, right? So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's at least it dances around it a little.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay, so we're on 7:35, being mindful of time.
We're over time.
No, just slightly. It's okay. We started a little late. But wanted to thank Josh again for the beautiful talk and the beautiful conversation that ensued after. Yeah, I think that's it for now. If other folks want, we have many other events coming up through Asian American Studies this semester through Critical Moves. We have a nightlife symposium in April that Karen is hosting with Ramon Rivera as one of the participants, and a basement Bhangra party next month. And I see Sarah Miners here who will be helping me with an event on April 1st around critical refugee studies in Southeast Asian America. So you can follow us on the socials, and just want to thank Josh again.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you everybody for putting up with me for this long.